My name is Vanessa Gould. I'm 42 and I am a documentary filmmaker from Brooklyn, New York. Boy, it's difficult for a documentary filmmaker to turn the camera around and look at oneself. I love weird stuff, and so my work reflects that. It was coming out of a job that I didn't like, and a good friend of mine who had been a documentary filmmaker for television for 3 decades, maybe 3.5 decades, said, you know what, Vanessa, get yourself a used camera and go find something you find interesting and make a short film about it. And I did exactly that. I got a used Panasonic DVX 100A, which is like worthy of a museum at this point. At the time I was really interested in the mathematics of origami, and then that grew into my first feature, which ended up going onto PBS, and so it just sort of went from there. One of the subjects of my last film was a solitary and sort of reclusive artist working in the medium of paper in the northern suburbs of Paris. Just as he was sort of changing that, and his work was really starting to break some boundaries, and he was getting some renown, he got sick with lung cancer and died at the age of 53. But he was still relatively unknown outside the world of paper arts. I had this incredible impulse to try and respond, I guess, as a documentarian to his loss and the cultural loss that followed his death. I mean, when he died, things were half worked, you know, pieces were half finished on his studio table, and he was so advanced in what his methods were that no one could ever finish them or figure out what he was up to. So it was lost with him. And that void was a really intense feeling for me, and so I called up a bunch of newspapers, including the New York Times and some papers in Europe and in the big cities in the United States, and just informed them of his death and sent some pictures of his work. And the only paper that ever wrote back was the New York Times, and they assigned one of their most sensitive, curious obituary writers to the assignment, and she called me, and I worked with her for almost a full day, sort of trying to supply her with the information that could help her write a good obituary on him, and she did. It was an incredible piece, and it understood his quirks and the nuance of his work, and they put his work online. I couldn't believe that the New York Times was willing to commit such precious real estate in their paper to an utterly unknown French artist. And so I started to really think about what they were doing and how they were making the choices that they were making, and I looked back and found other people from all around the world who were doing kind of obscure stuff, but who nevertheless sort of like left a fingerprint on our culture that was strong enough for it to be noteworthy or newsworthy. The interesting thing is that I think most readers enjoy reading the obituaries of people that they had never heard of, and I don't want to go so far as to say with certainty, but I believe many of the obituary writers would also say that they enjoy writing the obituaries of people that they had never heard of either. And so the Times has a certain, you know, being such a large international paper, they have to cover the big celebrities and movie stars and politicians that die. But I think the real exciting part for writers and readers is the people that did make an impact, that went below the radar, and people are really excited to read about once their life is finished and they can sort of assess it as a whole. Boy, I mean, I read so many incredible obituaries, and so many of them surprised me. Testament to the great writing, that they found stuff that like wasn't predictable and put it in. So it's almost an impossible question to answer. One thing that I could say is that their work is obviously of the highest caliber, and the fact that they do so much of it under such tight deadlines. You know, sometimes they'll get there in the morning. They have strange hours. They work sort of like from 11 till 7. So they get there at 11 o'clock in the morning, and then one of the editors will give them a name of someone they'd never heard of before. And by deadline at 7 o'clock, they have to literally be an authority on that person's life. And not just like the basics of it. They really have to understand the context and understand why, you know, what this person did within the sphere in the world that they were working to make them rise to that level of being worthy of an obituary. So, and then write an obit that's good and readable without errors. And so doing that to me just like once seems like you should get like a gold medal, but they do it every single day. It's like they go home at that night forget everything they learned that day and come in the next morning and do it all over again. And that sort of, that drumbeat of working under so much deadline pressure and doing it so well, blew me away. I mean, it's a testament to their professionalism. They are trained to do that, so it's not sort of like magic. But I just couldn't believe that they were able to work in the capacity that they do. They're very different. The 5 writers on the desk, at least that were featured in the film, have different things that they're expert in, and also different sort of personality traits that they bring to it, so that they're really like a complementary, good team. But nevertheless, they're all sort of cut out for this kind of work. And as the film says, the Obit's desk is usually some of the most seasoned reporters at the paper, and some of the oldest reporters at the paper, because they have so much experience to draw on, and they can work at just sort of like an incredibly efficient and high caliber. It can happen, I think, in a number of ways. If someone were to pin you up against a wall and say, what's the first thing right now that comes to mind that you think is interesting? Whatever you say. It's a great bet that you can make a documentary film about that, because it's you're not intellectualizing at all. It's like the first thing that comes to mind. I think there comes a point when you're a filmmaker or an aspiring filmmaker when you have this moment, like you've been traveling along your path and then you say, God, there needs to be a documentary about this. And I think it's smart to forget the documentary part while you're living your intellectual life and growing philosophically. And then you'll have that gut intuition. I think when you wake up in the morning and say, okay, I got to cross off my list that I need to find something to make a documentary about, it's sort of a horse before the cart thing, even though it seems like you're being proactive and stuff like that. And so I think, for me with the obituary film, I had a sort of a 6 or 7 other ideas in my mind that I was sort of slowly developing or thinking about doing. And when I started thinking about the obits and what they told us about ourselves and our culture and the fleeting nature of memory and why journalism includes this weird section of paper that's talking about what happened in 1940, I was like, this is it. But I didn't seek it out so much. It just sort of, it coalesced in front of me. And I think patience and curiosity can really take you a long way.